Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 8th of January, 2025. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today in the studio, Charles Malet. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very
Charles,
much,
happy New
Mike.
Year. And Vanessa Beeley is joining us from Lebanon. So we are going to start today with more on the grooming gangs story and, the statement that the lovely Yvette Cooper, our illustrious Home Secretary, made on Monday. Child sexual abuse, she said, and exploitation are the most vile and horrific crimes involving rape, violence, coercive control, intimidation, manipulation, and deep long-term harm. She said that perpetrators must be punished and pursued. Victims and survivors must be protected and supported. Well, the grooming gangs story is one part of this, but of course, the systemic child abuse that the UK has been involved in at the highest levels for the last number of decades has never been investigated. No one has ever been punished or pursued. Victims and survivors have never been protected and supported. So is this likely to change? I would suggest not. Now, interestingly enough, today the BBC had this article: men on secret 1970s pro-paedophile list could still work with children today. And they're saying here that they're talking about a secret list which has been handed to them by the Metropolitan Police. The Metropolitan Police, they say, has had this list for 20 years. And they've kept it secret. This has been handed to the BBC now for some reason. Why, we can talk about. They're talking about 300 people that belong to the Paedophile Information Exchange in the 70s, which at the time was calling publicly for the legalization of sex with children. As I say, the Metropolitan Police had this for a couple of decades. They've given it to the police now. To the BBC now. The BBC has tried contacting some of the people that are still alive on this. A couple of them have responded, most of them haven't. And they are saying that, of course, many of those people, or some of those people that are still alive, could still be working with children. And I'm going to say, well, it's great that the BBC has finally caught up with this, because one of the things that they haven't included in this story, of course, is something that we have been talking about for, well, since the beginning. So in May 2009, this article was published in 2011 in the UK Column newspaper that we were publishing at the time, and it begins. It's called Liberty Pie and Paedophiles. And it begins by saying, in May 2009, the UK Column exposed the links between the National Council for Civil Liberties, now renamed Liberty, and two paedophile organisations, the Paedophile Information Exchange and the Paedophile Action for Liberty. At the time, these two organisations were linked to Liberty. Harriet Harman and Patricia Hewitt held the posts of legal officer and general secretary, respectively. So they were working with the Paedophile Information Exchange to normalise the idea of paedophilia. And of course, Harriet Harman in later life said that she regretted having done that at the time, but nonetheless, that was done at the time, and there were efforts at the time to sort of launder the reputations of these people and to try to justify their activities. Now, we talked the connections don't just end with people that subsequently became politicians, and in fact, Harriet Harman's still serving in the House of Lords. Because in this article published in 2010, More Than Corrupt, we're talking about a guy called Matthew Byrne. Because it's not by coincidence that when we have been reporting on the grooming gang story on the UK Column website, we've mainly been reporting under the heading of the common purpose effect. Because what we're highlighting in this article and in all those common purpose effect articles is that common purpose is found everywhere where there's been cover up of this activity. And this particular article is highlighting a guy called Matthew Byrne, who was an egregious paedophile. He was prosecuted for it, is in prison for it, but of course had his own connections to the elites in this country. So here he is with David Cameron and Michael Heseltine. So, the connections are all there. So, when we're looking at this situation and looking at this headline in the Telegraph, for example, which is Labour to whip MPs to vote against grooming gang inquiry. So there's an effort to bring a national grooming gang inquiry going. And Keir Starmer is saying to Labour MPs today, no, you must vote against this. Well, the question is, why would he be doing that? Is he doing that because He is concerned about, as Ben was suggesting on Monday, concerned about the fact that a lot of this activity has happened in Labour-controlled council areas and that this is going to have an impact on the Labour Party? Or is this decision designed to enrage people in the population and keep them focused on the Muslim aspects of this and the Islamic aspects of this? I'm just going to say, reinforce this part of the story, because we've got to remember the Asian grooming gang part of this story is only a small part of a significant part, nonetheless, but a small part of the grooming gangs issue, because this is systemic in the United Kingdom. It has been at the heart of government and institutions in the UK for decades. And of course, the Church of England part of this, and this headline from a few days ago, Archbishop of York to take charge of the Church of England. And in this article, they're suggesting that the Church of England needs safeguarding reforms. Well, look, here's the thing. The Post Office inquiry, the inquiry into the Horizon IT scandal is going on, and that is an inquiry into the abuse of postmasters who were claimed to be stealing money from the Post Office, when in fact it was an IT scandal that was going on. Those people were abused for decades by the Post Office. Some of them committed suicide. Lots of them ended up in prison. None of them has had sufficient compensation for that. And the Post Office is dragging its feet over that story. And that's getting all kinds of outrage from people in the country. But nobody is outraged by the fact that the Church of England has never compensated the people that were abused under its auspices for decades. They have dragged their feet, despite the fact that they've got billions of pounds. They have dragged their feet over compensation for the people. If you want to know more about Church of England institutional child abuse, read Teresa Cooper's book, Pinned Down. It is worth the read. It gives a very good indication. The subhead on this, on her book, is One Girl's Harrowing and Disturbing Tale of Institutionalized Abuse. Abuse has been institutionalized in this country, not just by the Church of England, in care homes, by local authorities, not just Labour, Tory as well. We have been covering this for forever, for as long as the UK column exists. Nottingham Beechwood Children's Home, another example. Melanie Shaw's in a case, another case. And so if you're not aware of this story, have a look on the UK column website. Melanie Shaw has never received any compensation for what she went through either. Holly Gregg has never received any recognition, compensation. None of the people involved in her institutionalized abuse were prosecuted. Robert Greene, in fact, was prosecuted for attempting to protect Holly Gregg and give her some exposure for the story that and the abuse that she experienced. In the meantime, we continue, the British establishment, the media continues to launder the reputations of people like Edward Heath. And of course, laughably, somebody was suggesting that the King should intervene in this grooming gang story and maybe bring the government down, get Keir Starmer out of government if he's not prepared to deal with this properly. The King still has not answered questions about his connections, his friendship with Jimmy Savile. And Jimmy Savile was not just a radio DJ. We've got to remember he was also institutional, in the sense that for a period of time he was running Broadmoor mental prison, where some of the worst paedophiles in the country are held. So coming back to Yvette Cooper then, and what she said in her statement on Monday, she said she'll confirm that we'll make it mandatory to report abuse, and we'll put the measures in the crime and policing bill that we put before Parliament this spring. The protection of institutions can never be put before the protection of children. Again, you're going to have to demonstrate this, Yvette, because the protection of institutions has absolutely been put before the protection of children all the way through the last decades. And the grooming gangs, the Asian grooming gang story is only a part of this. We will introduce a single child identifier in the Children and Wellbeing Bill. So they're making sure they take advantage of the situation to pursue political aims, political policies that they were already pursuing. They're using this cynically as justification for this kind of thing. We are accelerating the work of the Child Sexual Exploitation Police Task Force. Believe it when I see it. A rise in 25% in arrests between July and September of this year of low-level paedophiles? How about getting a proper investigation at the high level, organized paedophile grooming gangs, not just Asian, but systemic gangs? Finally, she said, we have to face the serious challenge that the fast and growing area of grooming and child abuse is now online. Well, I dispute that because actually grooming and child abuse can only happen physically in person, and online might be used as a communication mechanism. But again, Yvette Cooper attempting to rather cynically use this as an effort to push forward with censorship and online safety legislation. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Charles, but we've got to absolutely, in my opinion, if we keep this a racial issue, we're missing the point. The Asian grooming gangs have got to be dealt with, prosecuted, but this goes much broader than that.
Yeah, it does. But I think that's a critical part of it. The narrative is very much wrapped up in the racial element, which I'm going to come on to in a minute. I think also the other part of this, in terms of breaking the cycle, is of course that the abuse of children and those that are caught up in it is a control mechanism of itself. So therefore, to break that cycle, when we're considering how the establishment does deal with any of this, seems extraordinarily improbable, especially since it's persisted for so many decades across such a spectrum of society. So I think there is a huge amount to it, but it does require, in the first instance, people who are not necessarily in elevated positions of power to flag things up and make a noise at the appropriate moment, which I think has failed largely because of top-down pressure not to do so.
But of course, part of the publicity for this has had to be driven from abroad.
It has, and it is perfectly bizarre in some senses because it seems to have come from nowhere. But somebody who has strode into this affair and several others is Elon Musk. Now, if you have the advantage of not being on Twitter, or X as it's now called, you will have missed his interventions. Just today, he has labelled Keir Starmer as evil for exactly as Mike's been describing, deciding, or at least whipping his MPs into not pursuing an inquiry into systematic abuse of children and the grooming gangs affair. But this, of course, is not all he's been up to. After appearing to support the Reform Party, he then sent a message on the 5th of January saying that the Reform Party needs a new leader. Farage doesn't have what it takes, which seems to have bamboozled Nigel Farage himself. But of course, the issue here seems to be Musk's support of Tommy Robinson and his probably willful misunderstanding of the reason for Robinson or Yaxley Lennon's imprisonment, which of course was the breach of a civil injunction not to publish or not to broadcast. And it's a result of a breach of that has put him into prison, rather than, as is consistently put by elements of the pro-Robinson camp, for telling the truth. But of course, the common thread here is that Elon Musk is most certainly an ally of Israel, and it's well known that Tommy Robinson is funded, or has been funded certainly in large part, by the pro-Israel lobby. Now, the other thing that Musk has done is to label Jess Phillips as a rape genocide apologist. Again, this is to relate to the refusal to conduct yet another inquiry. Baroness J, of course, saying that the previous inquiry should not be, in effect, added to. But the key fallout from here is Phillips's response to this, which first of all is remarkably tone deaf, suggesting that she is feeling endangered when, of course, they're talking about the abuse of children. So why she should consider her predicament as a recipient of a message on social media to be more damaging than what the children concerned have gone through is bewildering. But really what we're supposed to draw from this is that disinformation is harmful. However, we don't have to go so far back to see that Phillips is perfectly prepared to dish it out herself here. Guardian article from December 2015, Jess Phillips saying that she would knife Jeremy Corbyn in the front if he damages the Labour Party. So this all looks very theatrical. And the question really has to be, why is it that Elon Musk is intervening and indeed making himself look like the bad boy of social media, his ownership, of course, of the platform itself? But it looks almost as though the specific intent here is to tee up yet more action on the censorship front and indeed sanctions, criminal sanctions for this kind of activity, which is what plays off Phillips's incredible hypocrisy. The other point to make here is that in his use of X, the social media platform, a theme that emerged during 2024 was his use of the word reform, both capitalized, or at least with a capital R, and without, especially regulatory reform. Now, scrolling back through his content over the past few years, this is absolutely a new departure and appeared to be telegraphing what was announced after the Trump victory in the American election back in November, which was that Musk was granted the effectively, we were told he had the power to be running the Department of Government Efficiency, which has been referred to as Doge. There's obviously lots of speculation here about whether or not that's sort of an allusion to the cryptocurrency of the same name. But regardless, as seen on the screen here, this is concerning major reform. Now, exactly where this is going to go is, of course, highly questionable because it's not really a proper government department. It does seem to be yet another opportunity for Musk to create money for himself out of that provided by the taxpayer. But realistically, he will have very little to do with the Trump administration. For greater detail on this, I can point you towards Thinking Coalition on Substack. So there'll be a link to this in the show notes, with a well-articulated piece on the Department of Government Efficiency and exactly what it is that Musk may be up to in this. But it does seem that the meddling from Musk, who of course has employed Linda Yaccarino as chief executive of X. So whilst he's always championed as being the savior of free speech, she was very patent in saying that whilst free speech may indeed be championed, Twitter or X will not permit freedom of reach. So with content that she described as being lawful but awful, which in the UK was the harmful but legal sort of part of the online safety bill as it was then, leading up to it becoming an act. This is really all pointing towards further censorship. But as I say, with Phillips specifically, the critical link between disinformation and harm, and how people that are putting out disinformation are to be considered as, of course, extremists putting forward harmful content. So this will be one to watch, particularly with the Trump inauguration on the immediate horizon.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. We will move on now and welcome Vanessa to the program. Vanessa, welcome to the program. And how's the last couple of weeks been? Because events continuing to move on in the Middle East, but not much coverage in the Western media, as far as I can see.
No, apart from their attempts, of course, to rewrite history entirely as regards the last 14 years of interference by MI6 and CIA in Syria. I do recommend that everybody listens to the podcast 4 that you and I did, Mike, because this will be very relevant in relation to the report I'm going to put forward now, which is basically a few updates on the circumstances surrounding the departure of President Assad, and the final fall of Damascus, which of course led to my leaving Syria on the Sunday, the 9th of December. It does seem a long time ago now. So this was an interview about an hour and a half with Kamal Sakar, who was the head of media for the palace, for the president himself. This was given about 2 days ago, during which he gave a number of details on the final days and weeks before the fall of Syria. So let's have a look. It was basically summarized by, I think this is a UAE-based journalist. So he's doing a summary. He's not actually doing a transcript. Bear that in mind. So he says basically fascinating details about Assad's last day in this interview with Assad's media czar, his media chief and close aide, Kamal Sakar, as I mentioned. So let's have a look. What I've basically done, I've double-checked it with a number of people who were also closely involved with the presidential team. Some of the timeline leading up to President Assad's departure is apparently not 100% accurate. So I've teased out the information which basically ties in with the conversation that we had, Mike, in the fourth podcast on Syria. So he talks about the fact that the fall of Aleppo was very shocking for Assad. So clearly Assad was not aware that all of this was going to be happening in the very near future. Before Aleppo, the development seemed serious but not alarming. He had zero expectation such a thing would happen. The army was not mentally or logistically ready to fight, and Russia was at the peak of its distraction in Ukraine. In the months before the Aleppo operation, the visibility and presence of Shia militia in Syria had been reduced as Hezbollah had received heavy blows in Lebanon, and Syria was being closely surveilled by Israel. He then goes on to say, Assad had a very specific request from Putin to personally ensure the safety. What he's saying is Assad specifically asked Putin to ensure the safety for Iranian military support in Syria, including air supplies into Humane. I don't quite understand the bit about Russia was not in a position to get involved in Iran too. The Iranians told Assad they did not receive the signals. So despite the assurances apparently given by Russia, Iran didn't receive the signals or assurances from Russia that it was safe for them to fly to Humane, which was the Russian base on the coast in Syria, through Iraqi airspace. Assad then checked with Moscow, but he got no response. The Iranians told the Syrians a plane moved nonetheless from Tehran to Syria through Iraq, but were warned by the United States that the plane would be shot down if it continued on its way. News reports at the time indicated that the US at that point had struck Shia militias in Syria near the border with Iraq, and so the plane turned around and went back to Tehran. Then, basically, he says Assad realized that he was in trouble when Putin would not pick up his calls from Tuesday to Thursday, 3 days before his departure from Syria. At one point, Assad was told Putin was traveling in Belarus and wouldn't be able to take the call. The one thing that the media director does say in the interview is that this is not normal. Putin would be able to take the call at any time, wherever he was. So this excuse seemed to be nothing more than an excuse not to pick up the phone to Assad at this point. On Thursday, Assad prepared a 400-word speech, which is what I put out literally a day after I left Damascus, that a speech was prepared, which would be delivered on television. The speech had several sections. The first, warning about dividing Syria. The second, attacking Turkey and its dishonesty. The third, urging Arab support for Syrian unity. And finally, urging the Syrians to fight. It's also worth noting that at Doha, which was the end of November, Turkey, Iran, and Russia had come up with a deal where Assad would stay for 6 months to basically form a transitional government, which would include a coalition of current government members and members representing the various minorities inside Syria. It became clear at some point that probably Turkey reneged on this when HTS and other factions from the south entered Damascus. I think at that point it became very clear that this 6-month deal was not going to be fulfilled. As David Miller said on X, as a result of reading this summary of the interview, in sum, Bashar and Syria were sold out by Putin, who cut a side deal with Turkey to ensure Russia's interests would be protected in a future ISIS-run, colonized and fractured Syria. We have to remember that when we see the videos of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, very often those militants are wearing ISIS patches. That's why David's referring to them. Iranian policymakers were left blindsided and without either the time or the air support to help protect Syria's sovereignty against the ISIS hordes and their Turkish backers. The Zionist strategy of constant airstrikes on Syria over several years with Russian complicity and without a response from the resistance created the opportunities the Zionists needed. The US, Turkey, and the GCC all worked with this Zionist strategy to ensure an ISIS takeover. GCC, I would actually identify Qatar out of that as the primary player. Interesting that as this interview was published, this also came out, causes of the collapse of the Syrian government, disclosure by General Behruz Esparti, one of the senior commanders of the Revolutionary Guards in Syria, Russia was one of the main factors in the collapse of Syria and Assad. Russia turned off its radar so Israel could attack the intelligence headquarters in Aleppo. Russia both deceived Assad and betrayed Iran. Strong words. All Russian actions after October the 7th were to serve Israeli interests, also very strong words. And I just want to play, this was an interview given by Jolaní, the head of the transitional HTS government in Damascus.
المنطقة كانت ستتعرض إلى حرب إقليمية واسعة جدا. كان هناك حديث عن تدخل إسرائيلي إلى المنطقة وإلى سوريا، وكان يقال أنها ستكون الحرب الأكبر ما بعد غزة ولبنان، وهذا كان الواقع، لأن في حال كان دخلت القوات الإسرائيلية إلى سوريا فبالضرورة أن الإيرانيين سيزجون بالعراق لمواجهة هذا التقدم، وبالتالي تركيا تشعر بقلق كبير من التقدم الإسرائيلي. ستكون لديها مواقف في اعتقادي ستكون ضد الإسرائيليين وموافقة للإيرانيين، وهذا الأمر بالتأكيد سيستغل روسيا للفت الأنظار عن الحرب الأوكرانية، وبالتالي سيحصل هناك ردات فعل أمريكية، ولا يخلو الأمر من استهدافات في داخل طهران والخروج من بعض القواعد الخليجية، مما سيؤدي إلى أن ترد طهران على بعض القواعد الخليجية وسيتسبب في أزمة كانت كبيرة جدا. الحرب الخاطفة هذه أمنت كل المنطقة من هذه المخاطر المحتملة، وأمنت أمن الخليج بشكل أساسي إلى 50 سنة إلى الأمام، وكذلك الأمن القومي التركي أيضا تأمن، والأمن القومي لسوريا بالدرجة الأولى وللمنطقة بأكملها.
So what he's basically saying is that the HTS operation, we have to remember that Jolaní cancelled the first HTS attack, which was about 1 month prior, was effectively to derail the resistance operations against Israel and to protect the Gulf states, allowing them to normalize relations with Israel in the future. And if we want to hear the quiet agenda spoken out loud, we can always turn to Trump.
Turkey's been after that country in different names and different forms and shapes for 2,000 years. Those people that went in are from Turkey. And President Erdogan is a friend of mine. He's a guy I like, respect. I think he respects me also. He's the one that didn't go after certain people after I requested that he not. You know who I'm talking about? The Kurds. I don't know how long that's going to, because they're natural enemies. They hate each other. But he didn't do that yet, and he didn't do it in the past also. He started, and I said, please don't do that, and he didn't do it. So, but if you look at what happened with Syria, Russia was weakened, Iran was weakened, and he's a very smart guy, and he sent his people in.
Well, I don't think I need to add to that. As I say, Trump does generally say things out loud that should be kept quiet by the intelligence agencies.
Yes, thank you for that, Vanessa. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about what's next for Syria a little later in the programme. In the meantime, if you like what the UK column does, you'd like to support us, the place to go is support.ukcolumn.org. There's a link also on the front page of the main UK column website. You can support us in a number of ways. You can make a donation. You could join us as a member, and just reminder that if you do make a donation, that doesn't give you access to the extra programs and so on. So you do need to join as a member if you want to do that. There are various membership levels. You pick something up from the UK column shop. That helps us greatly. And if you do want to buy something from clivetocarl.com, if you use the link on here, we will get a small percentage of each sale, although it won't cost you any more to do that. If you can't do any of that, that's fine as well, but please do at least share the material and help us get past the censorship regime. So on various articles around the place on the website and blog posts and videos, you'll see the share links. Please use them if you can. Now, quick advertisement for an article we published yesterday, which is the latest from Dr. Piers Robinson on the OPCW, that's the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, cover-up of the claims by the West, at least, that there was a chemical weapons attack in Douma in Syria. This has been used to justify all kinds of rhetoric about the Assad government and so on, Vanessa. But of course, the story doesn't stack up. It has never stacked up. And Piers has done a good job of highlighting that in this article.
Yeah, and it's incredibly important to highlight this story again, because, of course, what is Western media now inside Syria doing? They're rewriting the history and revising the evidence that demonstrated the MI6 CIA interference since 2011, and the major part of that were the chemical attacks. So it's very important that Piers highlights the Douma travesty right now.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that. And Charles, food is going to be your topic in a second, but
it is absolutely. We've long been talking about the sort of enduring and indeed encroaching crisis in food security, farming. So there's going to be an event near Exeter on Saturday, the 18th of January, next Saturday, if it's something you are interested in terms of growing your own food and indeed sourcing food locally and all that sort of thing to protect your food supply as the year goes on, then please do take a look at that. The link for that will be in the show notes. And that leads into the next segment, which indeed does concern exactly this issue, which is, of course, food security, now to be challenged by something which UK Column was warning about throughout all of 2024, which was the absolute certainty that humans would be deemed to have died from what is being described as avian influenza. Now, this is not absolutely the beginning of it, but this is the beginning of it in the United States of America, announced here by the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, that they've got their first H5 bird flu death reported in the United States. Now, they describe this as being tragic, but that a death from H5N1 bird flu is not unexpected because of the known potential for infection with these viruses to cause severe illness and death. And this is the point where we bang exactly the same drum that we always do, which is to say that Kari Mullis, the inventor of PCR, described very specifically that PCR can find anything that you ask it to find. So this does not prove necessarily that somebody has died of something they're ascribing to be avian influenza H5N1. It merely confirms the existence of something they've asked it to look for as part of a closed loop scientific process by which they're describing this particular thing as being avian influenza. But of course, this is a narrative that's been building for some time, most prominently back in 2022. And we see here a BBC article from January of that year, and almost unbelievably, but perhaps not, bearing in mind it was the BBC, they used the example of a man called Alan Gosling, who was the first to have his poultry humanely culled, because he was told he was ill. But the critical part of the text here is that he was unaware he had the virus until he was advised to have a test. And of course, there began the cognitive dissonance required for the rollout of exactly this sort of thing, which is driven entirely by fraudulent testing of something that may not exist in the first place. But where this does lead is to the provision via the government's contract finder of what they're calling Poultry Culling Services Framework Agreement, which is a contract that is going to be worth up to £30 million. So this describes exactly what the government's intent is and reminds very much of the events of 2001 and Slaughtered on Suspicion, as covered very well by UK Column. So please do look that up on the website. This is open until the 22nd of January. And this is based on these statistics, which are that when I last reported on this in December, there were 11 cases declared by the government across the whole of the United Kingdom.
Not deaths.
Sorry, not deaths, exactly. This is cases, PCR-driven cases. At that time, DEFRA had not come back to me. They subsequently did, and 105,000 birds or thereabouts had been humanely culled. Now, the calculator tells me that this is an average of 9,545 birds killed by per one PCR case. So, as I say, on the closed loop basis, It's entirely possible that there was absolutely nothing wrong with any of these birds, and yet 105,000 of them then were killed. Now, the other thing to point out, because of course the goal here is manifold, we have, first of all, the massive ramp up of the sort of biosecurity spectre and indeed control over movement, not just for animals, but probably people. People are being asked to be fearful of all sorts of animals and people all over again. But of course, the push is for the pharmaceutical industry and vaccines. So we've got here another tender for what are called pathogen-free eggs to APHA. So these are for experimental purposes in order to work on the eggs themselves, but also hatchlings in order to develop pharmaceutical products. One imagines for vaccinating poultry, but possibly as well as humans, although of course humans do already have supposedly a vaccine against avian influenza. The other thing to point out about this week is that the Oxford Farming Conference and the Oxford Real Farming Conference, sort of rival gatherings, as it were, are taking place this week. Steve Reed, the Environment Minister, is to speak today, I believe, and no doubt this will be a familiar narrative of the peril that we face from climate change and therefore how we should balance food security with environmental measures. And it was just about a year ago that Steve Barclay set the wheels in motion, or at least the wheels in motion to come off later in the year, with the enormous increase in uncropped arable land going up 107% and leaving the UK with an increasing population and a decreasing supply of food. So there is very real reason to be concerned, at least, about the scarcity of food as it's likely to be, particularly bearing in mind the environmental conditions at the moment with the extraordinary swings between very cold and then very wet weather. So harvests for the coming year probably looking challenged already. And this would be the point to remind you that it was exactly, what are we on, 84 years ago since rationing began in the United Kingdom. Now, of course, rationing was accepted because people believed the state that they were in being one of emergency. Now, bearing in mind, we've just been talking about bird flu in humans. It does not need a huge amount more amplification to suggest that a state of emergency could indeed be brought about. And rationing at that point lasted for 14 years. So that's just a parting thought to consider.
Yes, thank you. Now, Vanessa, let's come back to Syria. And what is next? Are we going to see the balkanization of the country?
It certainly looks that way, but also this so-called transitional government that was only supposed to be very temporary. However, Jolaní has now said that new elections could take up to 4 years. And people on the ground have said to me, basically, that's because he has about a 5% popularity rating, and so he's desperate to increase that and retain power. Then also he's saying that there will be a 3-year delay on bringing through a new constitution. However, as the BBC reported, the UK government increased sanctions against President Assad. Of course, that was coercive punishment measures against the Syrian people collectively, not only against Assad. Otherwise, I would argue, what's the point of lifting sanctions now? If Assad is gone, then surely the sanctions should end. But of course, they are still in place against the Syrian people to make sure that they toe the line. So effectively, because Assad wouldn't push through the constitutional reforms that the UK government wanted, sanctions were increased about a year or so ago. Now I just want to show a quick video, which is, let's say, an example of the violence that's being meted out against particularly Alawite, but also Christian communities inside Syria. It's a relatively mild version of it, but it's an ongoing issue inside Syria right now. So if we can just play this.
لك لا تطفي بس اعطيني نداء قبل ما يطفى. يا شباب عبدو اعطيه يا عبدو.
Now, bear in mind, the pretext for this brutality is simply that they are regime remnants in quotation marks, so it can apply to anyone. And there are summary executions going on, as I said, on a daily, if not on an hourly basis. Let's have a look at the HTS so-called defense minister. His name is Mahaf Abu Qusara. However, he has various other names, including Hassan al-Hamawi. His qualifications: 20 premeditated murders, 15 armed robbery, 20 amputations, 150 cases of killing Shiite Christians and atheists, fighting infidels, 15 cases of stoning to death, 10 rape cases, sex with captives, and that's in Idlib. And if we just play a video of him destroying a statue of Mary, I'm not 100% certain where this is, but it will obviously be in a Christian community.
يلا يلا بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى لن يعبد في أرض الشام سوى الله ولن يقم إلا حكم الله ولن يعبد الجبت والطاغوت في أرض الشام بعد هذه الأيام بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى. لا نرضى بغير الله ودين الله وسنة نبي محمد بن عبد الله.
تكبير الله أكبر.
And then basically images have emerged showing Syria's newly appointed Justice Minister Shadi Mohammed al-Waisi overseeing the execution of 2 women back in 2015 in Idlib. I'm not going to show the video, but it's readily available online. And the excuse from HTS was that this was a previous phase in HTS's existence. So apparently these kind of executions are not ongoing, which of course they are. But then let's just have a look at a map of Syria showing how it has potentially been carved up. And of course, I mentioned the fact that there had been a deal, including President Assad staying for 6 months. And also he asked for guarantees that Damascus, Homs, Tartus and Latakia would be assured safety. And of course, they are not assured safety. HTS is carrying out the majority of its revenge killings and assassinations in the red area that you can see there that should have been assured safety by Turkey, and obviously it hasn't. But you can see clearly the green center there is HTS, or Turkey and Qatar, so the Muslim Brotherhood connection there. The yellow is the Kurdish, which is basically US and Israel, going down to the Druze, also in the south, which would also be Israel and the United States. And the red there, of course, is the so-called regime remnants, which, as I said, is far from being safe. But let's have a look at why this particular area would be interesting to both the US and to Israel and to Turkey. Because effectively in the central area and in the northeast, you can see the majority of the oil fields, the gas fields, the oil pipelines and the gas pipelines. I've also circled the coastal area because that includes the unexplored so far gas reserves off the coast of Syria. Why is that important? Because right now Turkey is pushing basically for the maritime agreement with HTS, which is interesting because they obviously have their eye on the gas reserves of the coastal area of Syria. And why is this important? Because this indicates, again, I wouldn't say laying blame at Russia, but this was from 2013 from the Washington Institute. A December 25 accord signed between Syria and Russia allows for the exploration and drilling in an area off the Syrian coast for oil or natural gas, which, if discovered, the state-controlled Russian group, Suzhusnil something gas, will have a controlling interest for 25 years. So basically, they would invest 15 million for surveying costs and another 75 million for initial drilling. This never happened. So Russia never actually went through with the exploration of the gas reserves. Now it looks like Turkey's going to steal the march, and if it succeeds in making the maritime deal with HTS, potentially it then has control of those gas reserves and the central hydrocarbon reserves also.
Thank you, Vanessa. Where does that take us?
Legislation.
Legislation.
Yes.
Back to the UK then.
Back to the UK, and the Starmer regime has now been rolling on for 6 months, and that means that there's been quite a bit of legislation queuing up, and therefore a certain amount to be pushed out as the year goes on. And obviously there's far too much to cover, but I've just brought out a few bits of it, some of which goes back to late last year. But one thing that's being mentioned with increasing frequency now is the forthcoming crime and policing bill. Now, back in November, the Home Office put out a note about what are called respect orders. Now, they are supposedly to be dealing with antisocial behaviour and with those who are bringing misery to communities. So I'll leave you to consider who might be bringing misery to communities, but the government, funnily enough, have individuals in mind. And as far as adults are concerned, this is really to replace what were civil injunctions. They can be applied by police or local authorities. And there's critically here that, like many of these sorts of orders, whilst they place very serious restrictions on people's behaviours and lives, in that they might be banned exclusively from a particular area, or they might even go so far as to have mandatory rehabilitation of the particular behaviours that have been deemed antisocial. But there's no requirement for a conviction for such an order to be put in place. And of course, a breach of the order could lead to a 2-year prison sentence. It's entirely subjective, like so much of this legislation. Who decides what constitutes antisocial behaviour with particular reference to these respect orders? But they are to become part of this crime and policing bill, which is due to be pushed out over the spring of this year. There are also perplexingly unlimited fines, which, bearing in mind the demographic who are largely associated with antisocial behaviour, makes one wonder what the purpose of that would be, other than to completely ruin people's lives. But of course, this is the element of pre-crime. Effectively, it joins the ranks of the Public Spaces Protection Order, where we had the ban on silent prayer, the knife crime protection order, the serious violence reduction order, where there, again, similarly was no requirement for a conviction for knife crime, for something to be stuck on your back and enable police to search you at will with absolutely no evidence of any wrongdoing. So this is the direction of travel, for want of a better phrase. Now, the other thing that is due to be coming up in this bill, which was debated in the House on the 6th of January in a debate on child exploitation and abuse, it is exactly what Mike has referred to slightly earlier in the programme. But just to go through that quote again, she says that I can confirm that we will make it mandatory to report abuse and put the measures in this bill, the Crime and Policing Bill, and to make it an offence with professional and criminal sanctions. The reason I'm drawing those particular parts out from this act is that they overlay onto the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill, which again Mike's already touched on and was referred to by Diane McCaddy in the programme on Monday. But the important thing to come out of here is this crossover here with this mandating, or indeed the duty to share safeguarding information. Now, there's been a consistent failure across the board for this to have happened, but what I want to draw your attention to is this idea that there is a duty to share information, and indeed how it's enforced or what it may be subject to. And the critical section here says, but the duty imposed by subsection 2, which is the duty to inform, does not apply if the relevant person considers that the disclosure would be more detrimental to the child than not disclosing the information. I'm not dismissing out of hand that there may be situations in which it is very hard to be sure that in disclosing something you are not putting somebody at risk. And of course, there are many other situations in life where this could be the case. But more than likely, this is really just going to be a get-out-of-jail-free card. And whilst we consider people that have had a few of those over the last few years, the Archbishop of Canterbury, as he was, of course, is absolutely the prime example of how the establishment fails to deal with its own. And symbolically here, all he has to do is place a wooden walking stick on the ground, and that's it for him. Of course, having failed over many years to deal with horrific abuses, and exactly like Mike said earlier in the news, the church has, in effect, just completely turned its back on this, and it looks very much like it will carry on being business as usual. Now, the other piece of legislation to have a quick look at, bearing in mind its enormous profits from wind turbines or wind renewable energy from last year is the Crown Estate Bill. Now, the Crown Estate was incorporated back in 1961 by the Crown Estate Act, and what they're seeking to do now is to change it, effectively enabling a different structure specifically with regard to borrowing and investing. And this is something that hasn't been enabled before because there have been restrictions on it, one might say quite rightly so, but the specific text says that they'll have a broader power to borrow subject to Treasury consent. And this is where it becomes more interesting, because while of course the Crown Estate belongs in effect to the King, because it's been incorporated, the profits from it are paid into the Treasury's Consolidated Fund. Now, the Consolidated Fund goes back to 1787 and was described then as being one fund into which shall flow every stream of public revenue, and from which shall come the supply of every service. Now, in suggesting the changes that they are with the Crown Estate Bill, this is a fundamental upset of that principle, because in 1968, the National Loans Act gave us the National Loans Fund, from which the government may borrow and lend. Both are administered by the Treasury, and the bank accounts are maintained by the Bank of England. So it's all complicated to a certain extent, but what this might enable is what could be regarded as in a sort of money laundering system, because in seeking, in government language, to modernise the Crown Estate by removing these limitations, and they say that this would otherwise restrict its long-term viability if they don't, but particularly they're talking about energy security. And I say again, that last year they recouped a £1.1 billion profit. Now, of course, because they're a corporation, it's up to them to manage what constitutes, or at least what profit they are left with at the end of the year. However, if the commissioners do borrow from the Treasury, or they borrow from elsewhere with Treasury consent, especially with public infrastructure in mind, then what they're doing is they're borrowing from the National Loan Fund as opposed to the Consolidated Fund, which means that taxpayer money is coming out to a corporation which may be used for whatever purpose. And it's up to the incorporated entity that is the Crown Estate to declare what profit they have after that. Of course, they have to repay, but it looks very much like they'll be repaying into the part of the Treasury that is not for the provision of public services. So this is a fundamental change to what the Crown Estate is supposed to do, which is supposed to raise revenue for the Consolidated Fund for the use of public services. And this would allow not just for a fundamental shift in this, but also the double whammy effect of probably, most likely bearing in mind what happened last year, an uplift in investment in offshore wind and other renewable energy platforms, which of course are heavily subsidised by the taxpayer. So yet another tranche of public money going straight towards the Crown Estate and into their pockets. And of course, no great surprise, but a review of salaries was also mentioned in the bill.
Yes, well, we'll keep an eye on that. Are you saying any change? Is this change agenda, or is this acceleration of continuing?
Yeah, I think a change of pace, I think. And perhaps one's prone to imagine these sorts of things at the beginning of a new year. But especially on the legislation front, it does seem like things are picking up. But a change of direction, no. A change of pace, possibly.
Yes. Everybody will know, I'm sure by now, that Nick Clegg has resigned from Facebook. And the question was, why now? And perhaps we get a clue as to why now, because he's been replaced by someone who is much more Trumpist in his approach, perhaps. But following the departure of Nick Clegg, who's been very much a proponent of censorship on Facebook, Facebook is now claiming to be wanting to ease the censorship burden that we have all faced over the last period of time. The wonderful Mark Zuckerberg had a couple of things to say about it. Let's just look at a minute or so of what he said.
Hey everyone. I want to talk about something important today, because it's time to get back to our roots around free expression on Facebook and Instagram. I started building social media to give people a voice. I gave a speech at Georgetown 5 years ago about the importance of protecting free expression, and I still believe this today. But a lot has happened over the last several years. There's been widespread debate about potential harms from online content. Governments and legacy media have pushed to censor more and more. A lot of this is clearly political, but there's also a lot of legitimately bad stuff out there. Drugs, terrorism, child exploitation. These are things that we take very seriously, and I want to make sure that we handle responsibly. So we built a lot of complex systems to moderate content. But the problem with complex systems is they make mistakes. Even if they accidentally censor just 1% of posts, that's millions of people. And we've reached a point where it's just too many mistakes and too much censorship.
So if you've stopped laughing by now, then we'll talk about what he said next, which was basically a recognition that the ground is shifting under his feet, that Donald Trump is arriving, and that he needs to sort of reset relations with the forthcoming presidency, and he's worried that Trump is going to basically sanction Facebook in some way. So they are moving forward with this claim that they are removing significant parts of the censorship regime, which includes removing the fact checkers. And well, of course, in the UK, Facebook gives 300 to 400,000 pounds a year or so to Full Fact for running the fact-checking service on its platform in the UK. This is what Full Fact had to say about Meta's decision. Meta's decision to end its partnership with fact-checkers in the US is disappointing and a backward step that risks a chilling effect around the world. From safeguarding elections to protecting public health to dissipating potential unrest on the streets, fact-checkers are the first responders in the information environment. So they are the white helmets of Facebook in this case, and maybe got the color wrong there. But anyway, locking fact checkers out of the conversation won't help society to turn the tide on rapidly rising misinformation, says Chris Morris, the chief executive of Full Fact. And the important point here is that this situation, it only applies in the United States. It doesn't apply in the United Kingdom. It doesn't apply in the EU, where the regimes are somewhat different. And Facebook is going to be moving to the model that X has been running for a little bit of time now, which is the idea that there'll be community posts put under content which is viewed as being somehow controversial. So, of course, the UK column's still locked out of Facebook. Vanessa, I believe you're still locked out of Facebook. Is that correct?
Yep, definitely.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll see all this situation change just as we did with Twitter and so many cases after Musk took over. But look, the other thing that I want to highlight on the censorship agenda is the situation with David Icke, because let's bring some Dutch media on screen here. We'll do a quick translation of this. The headline from Tro. Apologies, I don't know how to pronounce that, but anyway, from this media outlet in the Netherlands is David Icke is not allowed to address protesters via large screen. And basically he was invited to speak at an event in Dam Square a week or so ago, and he was not allowed to do that because the mayor of Amsterdam decided that he should not be allowed to be brought in remotely and shown on a large screen. So the mayor sent a letter to the event organizers. She said that only speakers physically present at the demonstration would be allowed to speak or to use the PA system. She said that she was worried about spontaneous counter-protests sparked by Icke's participation, considering the unrest and protests his anti-Semitic views and past statements have caused. His online presence would only provoke similar responses this time. Now, this follows the renewal of the travel ban, which was placed on David Icke by the Dutch courts in November 2022. So this is 3 years now of banning. Although this has been a ban that's been imposed by the Dutch courts, it applies to the entire Schengen area. So he's not allowed to travel to basically anywhere in the EU. And that ban was renewed following a hearing on the 27th of December. Now, according to the court, Icke basically is accused of saying very naughty things, asserting that politicians orchestrated COVID-19 pandemic as part of a broader agenda, he's undermined democratic institutions apparently, and he could incite violent resistance. and of course supported by the various organizations like the National Coordinator for Anti-Semitism Prevention. He's accused of pushing forward old anti-Semitic narratives repackaged in a modern form. So look, he posted on his Instagram the statement that he made to the court. I'm just going to play a minute or so of that. It's worth listening to the whole thing.
I am banned from the virtual entirety of Europe. I cannot speak in any of those countries for the crime of agreeing to come to the Netherlands 2 years ago and speak at a peace rally calling for peace. And on the basis of that, I have been unable to enter Europe ever since. And what this comes down to, I won't abuse my vocal cords of responding to this any longer. But what this comes down to is this. Either the judiciary of the Netherlands is there to protect the people from the abuse of power of the government as a check and balance, or it is there, and that's been my experience in the last 2 years, it is there to do what the government wants done. And if that's the case, the Netherlands is no longer a liberal democracy. It is a tyranny, quite demonstrably. And I would say this to finish. I have been accused in these cases by these government lawyers, Pell Ricken, of being a threat to democracy. I may not have to remind the court that the Netherlands currently has a prime minister in Dick Schoof, who is unelected and has never seen a ballot box in his life, a former head of Dutch intelligence. And I am a threat to democracy. It's a joke. The whole thing is a joke and should be seen as such. I have nothing more to say.
And I struggle to disagree with anything in that statement. So no matter what you think about David Icke, it is incredible that we have a situation with someone who has committed no criminal offense is unable to travel in the whole of Europe because somebody is claiming that he has anti-Semitic views, which I think is stretching things beyond credibility. But anyway, we'll talk more about this in Extra in a couple of minutes. We have to leave it there for today. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Vanessa and Charles, and we'll see you in a few minutes. If you're a UK Column member, just stay on the stream, and we'll be back in a few minutes, as we say. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.